So today's video is going to be a little bit of a discussion about the Time 100 Best YA Books of All Time list that came out recently. And first, I just want to say I think it's amazing in general that something as well known as Time has even dedicated a list to YA books. They had a lot of really positive things to say about the importance of the YA age range, which I think is fantastic. And then also, I just want to say congratulations, of course, to every author that had a book featured on that list. This reaction video is not in any way trying to claim that the books that were on this list did not deserve to be on that list. So it's nothing of that sort. I just have some thoughts about the list, and I figure some of you probably do as well, so that's why I wanted to sit down and chat about it. The first thing I want to mention is just how different one book from the next on this list is, and I think that's specifically due to the fact that YA books, and I'm sure I have said this myself before, but often people say the YA genre when YA is an age range. It refers to young adult, and at least in America, the target audience are readers aged 12 to 18. But within that age range, you can have contemporary, you can have literary, historical fiction, fantasy, sci-fi, you can have every genre you can think of within that age range. But what's interesting is on this list, they're talking about books that are exceptionally powerful and influential. And a lot of those, as a result, ended up being books that are more related to topics people are going through right now or experiencing right now, or are touching on social issues, political issues, and things that teens can relate to. So a big portion of this list was, I would say, more kind of contemporary, hard-hitting type of stories, which nothing against. I just think that there's already a lot of conversations about genre bias and how certain genres are more meaningful or are better than others. And when you take something that is an age range and then you're talking about the best books in that age range, inevitably some things are going to get left out. And so I think that's why we had quite a few books that maybe a lot of us really connect with, or a lot of us feel are very influential, that we still as a result didn't see on this list. I don't have necessarily issues with the fact that they're including more of these hard-hitting contemporary type of stories or historical fiction, those kinds of things. I just think that it sadly does maybe unintentionally, accidentally contribute to the idea that things like sci-fi and fantasy cannot be important books, or they cannot be meaningful books. I am a fan of fantasy. I think it's important to just note that immediately. So, of course, I'm going to be somebody that I think a lot of people would expect to be disappointed in the lack of fantasy books on the list. But ultimately, I understand why there wasn't a lot of fantasy. I think just in general, it's something that collectively a lot of people just don't think that fantasy and sci-fi and other genres as well, a lot of people just don't find them to be as meaningful. I think that sometimes it's meaningful in a different way. There were books that were fantasy on the list. I do want to note that. Most of the time, they were exceptionally popular. Seeing as a lot of you are also really big fans of science fiction fantasy, I'm curious if you at all wish there had been more science fiction fantasy on the list, or if you are very understanding of the fact that there was not. Do you think this is a societal thing, or do you think just fact of the matter is that fantasy and sci-fi are typically not as significant to most people? And again, I do understand why there wasn't as much, but one thing I want to note is that I personally have found from talking to a lot of people that they had a love of reading when they were younger, and then as they got into the young adult age range, they were required to read books that typically they weren't very interested in, and they were not really encouraged to pick up other books that were appealing to them. And a lot of times what keeps people loving reading is picking up science fiction fantasy stories. It's something that allows them maybe to escape the difficulties of their own life and the pressures of school and just fitting in and all the things that come with being a teenager. I just think that's an interesting thing to point out. I would love to know your opinion about that particular point. Next thing I want to mention, and I brought this up when I did my reaction to the top 100 fantasy books of all time, which is the way they went about deciding the books that would be on this list. They had a list of authors, and they have a little bit of information about here's a kind of behind the scenes of how we came up with this list. And I'm not going to go too in depth with this point. I think that there's no official way and perfect way to establish this list. If you get people that aren't writers, then people are going to say, well, these people aren't even writers, so what do they know? And then if you get writers, you're going to say, well, of course they're biased. Of course their books are going to be on the list. You're going to, no matter what, have this sticky situation. I actually did a whole video because there were individuals saying that booktubers should have made lists and been selected to make these lists. And I made a whole video basically being like, please don't have us make that list. So if you're interested in seeing that, I'll have it linked down below as well as the first time list reaction. But I do think that there were there was just some interesting choices on this list, which is the next thing I want to get into. This list is not young adult. I actually was messaging some book friends of mine when this list was released, and I told them it should be called Some Books You May Have Come Across at Some Point in Your Life, possibly as a youngster. Because that's what this list was. So there's a lot of different things to this point. This is the main point that I wanted to talk about in this video, and I'm gonna try to be concise here. So first off, I don't think that just because it's a book that you can discuss in high school and read in high school and go into in a class in high school or have as assigned reading, that doesn't necessarily make it a young adult book. It makes it a book that you may have come across as a young adult, and it also can have a lot of meaning. And it doesn't mean that somebody who is within the young adult age range cannot read outside of young adult. Of course they can. And it should be encouraged too for them to read anything they want and to have as many things open to them as possible, make it as accessible as possible, all that absolutely for. But the fact of the matter is, there were books on this list that I'm like, that's not young adult. I have never seen it sold in young adult, and it's a little strange to me that it's on this list as young adult. So for example, Little Women, Catcher in the Rye, and To Kill a Mockingbird. I think that, again, they have a whole how we came up with this list. So check that out and then read through that. I think the idea is to kind of show how we got into young adult, because young adult is something that has not necessarily existed as a specific age range to sell into. It's not something that's been around for the entirety of books as we know them and as they are sold today. It's a relatively newer concept, and it sort of got its roots in the 1960s. So I can understand why they wanted to find books that they feel led into that, but I don't think that those are young adult books. And then on top of that, you have books that are absolutely not young adult books. They are middle grade books. And that also is frustrating to me, because at this point, just say books, like the top 100 books that we think young people should read, or something along those lines. Because when you call it young adult books, when you say YA books, I expect to see young adult books on the list. That to me would be like making the top 100 best fantasy books of all time and then throwing books in there that are, I'm sorry, I'm trying not to get worked up, but it'd be like throwing books on the fantasy list that weren't fantasy. Maybe you could get away with sci-fi because they're often together. It's like throwing in a thriller or historical fiction that has no fantastical elements whatsoever into the fantasy list. So for me, it's like, that's not, I know I'm mentioning a genre thing again, and I'm talking about the genre crossover, but just to relate this to the other time list, if you're gonna call it YA books, I expect YA books, and I kind of expect YA books as we know them. You can have another list of these are the books we think led into this list over here that we've created. I think that makes sense, kind of a map, if you will, kind of laying out the path and explaining, like, this is how we feel this led to it. Or make a whole thing about the history of young adult books and go deep dive into that. That is different to me than a top 100 YA. I went to school for education, music education specifically. Music education is, which I think this is silly, but it's certified to teach K through 12. So when I graduated college, and even before then, when I was in high school still, I started teaching private lessons, and for roughly 10 years, I taught people of all ages, mostly kids and teens. And I do not care for when the things that young people enjoy are trashed on or are not valued for what they are. I think there needs to be art that is something that young people can read and enjoy without grown adults trashing all over it. So I'm a little sensitive to it because having worked as a private violin teacher and working in schools, working with kids and knowing that they're trying to enjoy something that society is telling them is lesser and is useless and is worthless, it just makes me sad. Like, no wonder kids stop reading. No wonder they stop being interested in it, because the things that they're required to read in school may not be really what they're interested in. And then also the things they're actually interested in, you have people telling you that it's not very good and it's not very worthwhile. So I hate that, because being a teenager is hard enough. You are told, like, hey, by the way, soon you're going to have to decide what you want to do for the rest of your life, and then you're going to have to save up a lot of money just in case you don't get a scholarship, and you might have to get student loans. And then also there's just so much pressure when they're that age, when somebody is that age. And if young adult books make their life a little bit better, great. If it's something they enjoy, great. And then when you make a list of the best top 100 young adult books, and they're not young adult books, I just feel like it reiterates the point that young adult books, we can't even make a list of young adult books with actual young adult books. It just frustrates me a little bit, because I'm sure unintentionally so, but to me, comes across like the books that we know of as young adults are not good enough. The things that young adults enjoy are not actually good enough to make their own list. So let's include other things. Now I'm getting too heated for something so silly. This is not something that deserves probably this much frustration over, but I'm sure all of you have you've seen the blog post, you've seen the videos, you've seen people go off. And like I said, usually adults going off about why young adults is lesser. And to have this list, which again, I'm grateful, and I think they said a lot of nice things about the young adult age range, which was great. And then I was scrolling through the list, like, this is middle grade books, and then some of these are just books that are for adults, but then sometimes younger people read them. So I think you get the point. I don't think I need to keep going off about this. I do appreciate the recognition to young adult books, and I do appreciate all of the effort that went into making this list. I'm sure it was very difficult. It's such a difficult task to ask people to come together and decide the best books. I don't even like deciding my own favorite books, because I'm like, oh, I don't want to leave off this one series, because then I feel bad, even though it's not a person, it doesn't have feelings. So it's a tremendous amount of effort for the people who decide on the books, and I'm not trying to put them down. And again, I'm not trying to say that any one author's work didn't deserve to be on this list. I just think that the list is interesting. It's interesting, and I'm very curious to know your thoughts on all of it. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.